The full line trembled in Megan O'Brien's hands. Just barely. Just enough that Dr. Hargrove, watching from the doorway of room for 47, could see it. Her shoulders curved inward like she was trying to fold herself smaller, make herself less visible, less present. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical hymn above them, casting everything in that harsh white glow that made skin look grey and made mistakes look magnified. She didn't look up. She never looked up when he was in the room. "Saline lock," she said quietly to the patient, a woman recovering from gallbladder surgery. "Just routine maintenance. You won't feel a thing." Her voice was soft. Apologetic. The voice of someone who'd learned early that speaking drew attention, and attention was a dangerous thing. The needle slid in with practiced ease, the kind of ease that comes from 10,000 repetitions, from muscle memory that lived deeper than thought. From a time when steady hands meant the difference between life and someone being carried out in a black bag. But Dr. Hargrove only saw the trembling. He saw middle-aged. He saw competent enough. He saw a nurse who kept her head down and her mouth shut and didn't ask questions about things that weren't her concern. Which made her exactly the problem he'd been thinking about since 3 o'clock that afternoon. Megan finished the 4-check, BP stable, O2 sat 96%, heart rate regular, and made a note in the chart. Precise handwriting. Meticulous. The kind of charting that left no room for interpretation, no room for mistakes. She'd been charting like this for 3 years at Oak Creek Memorial, ever since the day she'd walked through those doors with a resume that had a 7-year gap and a single reference that said only no comment. The gap. The 7 missing years. No one asked about it, which meant everyone wondered about it. She wheeled the 4-stand back to the wall and moved toward the patient's monitor, checking the rhythm strip. Sinus rhythm. Regular. Normal. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that would draw Dr. Hargrove's attention if she was lucky. If she stayed small enough. If she didn't make him notice her the way he was starting to notice her anyway. Back at the nurse's station, the computer screen glowed like a pale sun in the dim light. Megan settled into the rolling chair and pulled up her charting queue. Room for 47 post-op vitals. Room for 51 medication reconciliation. Room for 49, that one could wait. But room for 48 had a discharge summary that needed review, and the billing codes attached to it made her stomach tighten. She scrolled through the surgical report. Laparoscopic cholecystectomy. Standard procedure. 2 hours on the clock. Straightforward. Then she looked at the billing codes. Phantom procedures. Charges for a second surgeon who'd never set foot in the OR. Equipment costs that had been billed twice. 3 medications on the invoice that she'd personally verified the patient had never received. The numbers stacked up in a pattern so deliberate it couldn't be accident. It was choreography. It was intention. Megan's jaw clenched. Just barely. Just enough that her back teeth met with a small click. She'd worked in places where medicine was practiced with whatever you had, sometimes just gauze and determination and the knowledge that if you didn't move fast enough, people died. Phantom billing. Inflated costs. Medications charged but never given. That wasn't negligence. That was theft wearing a white coat. She opened the next file. Room for 49. Same pattern. Different surgeon. Same ghost procedures, same doubled equipment costs, same medications that had somehow been billed but never used. And the one after that. And the one after that. 7 files. All from the past 3 weeks. All post-operative. All carrying Dr. Hargrove's signature in the authorization field. The fluorescent light above the nurse's station buzzed like an insect trapped in glass. Megan leaned closer to the screen, her eyes moving through the codes with the careful attention of someone reading a threat in a foreign language. Every line confirmed what she already knew. Every number told the same story. This wasn't careless. This was systematic. This was someone who'd learned exactly how much he could steal before anyone would look closely enough to see. Working late. Megan's hand stilled on the keyboard. She didn't turn around. She recognized the voice, had learned to recognize it the way prey animals recognize the sound of a predator's footstep. Dr. Hargrove stood behind her. Close enough that she could smell the cologne, something expensive and chemical, something that didn't belong in a hospital. His shadow fell across the computer screen. She could see him reflected in the monitor's black border, tall, silver-haired, the kind of handsome that doctors learned in medical school, the kind that made patients trust him without knowing why they shouldn't. Just finishing the discharge summaries, Megan said. Her voice was steady. Careful. The voice of someone who'd learned to control the small things when the big things weren't under her control. She didn't close the billing file. Not yet. But her finger moved toward the keyboard, ready to switch screens if he moved closer. Dr. Hargrove's eyes moved across the monitor. 3 seconds. 4. 5. Long enough to see what she was looking at. Long enough to understand that she understood. Those can wait until morning, he said quietly. Hospital policy. No charting after 10 p.m. without supervisor approval. There was no such policy. Megan had worked 3 years without hearing of it. But she understood what he was really saying. She understood the shape of the threat underneath the words. Of course, she said. I didn't realize. My apologies, doctor, would have been the old response. The one he expected. The one that would have made her smaller still. Instead, she just nodded. She saved her work without closing the billing files, letting them sit in the background where they lived, where he knew she'd found them. She stood, wheeled the chair back into place, and moved toward the exit with a kind of calm that came from having already survived worse than threats masked in administrative policy. Dr. Hargrove didn't move. He stood in her path like a man who'd learned that hospitals were kingdoms and he was the king of this one. I'd like you to stay late tomorrow, he said. 6 o'clock. We need to review your documentation protocols. Some inconsistencies in your charting that need addressing. It wasn't a request. That was the thing about the way he said it, the certainty in his voice, the way his body didn't have any doubt in it. It was a command dressed up in administrative language. It was him making sure she understood that he knew what she knew, and that knowing things was dangerous. Megan reached up and touched the fabric of her jacket right over her ribs, where the patch was sewn inside the lining. The faded 5th Medical Battalion patch. The one she wasn't supposed to have. The one that meant something she couldn't talk about, couldn't explain, couldn't acknowledge in this fluorescent-lit world where she was just a middle-aged nurse with trembling hands and a 7-year gap on her resume. I understand, she said. Dr. Hargrove smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. Good. I think we're going to understand each other very well, Megan. He moved aside to let her pass. She went to the break room, where the microwave hummed and the coffee smelled like it had been brewing since breakfast. The clock on the wall read 11:53 p.m. She had 1 more hour before the night shift ended, 1 more hour before she could leave this place and breathe air that didn't smell like antiseptic and threat. She pulled up the patient roster on her phone, the digital one, the encrypted one, the one no one knew she checked at the end of every shift. New admissions. Room for 07. Room for 08. Room for 10. And there, at the bottom of the ICU census list, a name that made her breath catch. Admiral Chen. Rear Admiral. Admitted at 14:30 hours. Cardiac emergency. Post-operative status. Megan's hands went very still. Admiral Chen. The man who'd pinned her son David's commission 2 years ago. The man whose face she'd only seen in photographs, in dress uniform, in the kind of official military portraits that looked like they'd been taken by people who understood the weight of command. Her phone screen glowed in the darkness of the break room. The name sat there like a sentence that hadn't been finished, like a door that had been locked for 7 years and had just swung open. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Admiral Chen was in the ICU. In the hospital. In Oak Creek Memorial. Under the care of a man who'd just threatened her for looking at his billing codes. under the care of the one doctor in this city who had the most to lose if Megan O'Brien decided to talk. The fluorescent lights buzzed their endless hymn, and Megan sat in the darkness of the break room, understanding that whatever came next would change everything. The fluorescent lights buzzed their endless hymn, and Megan sat in the darkness of the break room, understanding that whatever came next would change everything. She wasn't wrong. It was already beginning. Room for 47 was warm and bright when Dr. Hargrove pushed through the door at 8:24 a.m., his white coat still pristine from the morning, his face arranged in the expression of a man who'd just discovered incompetence in the ranks. Mr. Patterson lay propped at 30 degrees, recovering from a triple bypass, his wife Helen and their 2 adult children positioned like sentries around his bed. Megan was adjusting the post-op drainage catheter, checking the collection chamber, her movements precise and measured. She didn't look up immediately, but she felt him before he spoke. The air pressure changed. That was how predators announced themselves, not with sound, but with presence. Nurse O'Brien, Hargrove's voice cut the room like surgical steel. Explain to this family why you failed to document the medication administration I specifically ordered yesterday. Megan's hands continued their work. One more gentle adjustment. One more check of the numbers. Then she straightened, turned, and met his eyes without hurrying. Doctor, I documented exactly what was administered according to your orders. The discrepancy you're referring to. Are you calling me a liar, Nightingale? The nickname landed like a weapon. He used it deliberately now, every time, calibrating its contempt. Your incompetence is why patients like Mr. Patterson suffer complications. Perhaps if you spent less time second-guessing physicians and more time doing your actual job, we wouldn't be having this conversation in front of his family. He gestured at Helen, at their children, at their stunned faces. This is what happens when nurses overstep their scope. Patients suffer. Helen's hand found her husband's shoulder. Their daughter looked away, embarrassed for everyone involved. Mr. Patterson himself, confused from the sedatives, uncertain, watched Megan with the careful attention of a man trying to understand if he should be afraid. Megan took one measured breath. Just one. Her jaw didn't clench. Her voice didn't crack. But she let a single tear trace down her cheek, then wiped it without breaking eye contact. The gesture was controlled, inevitable as rain, and it carried more weight than any argument could. I have never compromised a patient, doctor, she said quietly. Not once in my career. The room went dead silent. Hargrove's face darkened. He'd expected defensiveness, tears, apologies. He'd expected her to crumble. Instead, she'd done something worse, she'd been dignified about it. He turned sharply and left, his shoe heel striking the tile with a sound like a gavel. The door closed behind him with a soft pneumatic hiss. 3 days later, Megan entered the break room at 12:15 p.m. with her lunch, a turkey sandwich she'd made at home, an apple, a bottle of water. 5 veteran nurses were mid-conversation by the refrigerator: Linda, Carrie, Beth, Marcus, and Donna. They'd worked these halls for years. These were her colleagues, the ones who'd helped her through her first impossible weeks at Oak Creek Memorial. The ones she'd trusted. The moment she sat at the table, Linda checked her watch. Oh, look at the time. I need to grab something from my locker. She stood, gathered her lunch, and left. 15 seconds later, Carrie made an excuse about checking supplies. Then Beth followed, claiming she'd promised to help the afternoon shift prep medications. Within 90 seconds, Megan sat alone at a table still warm from their coffee cups, still smelling faintly of the vanilla creamer Linda preferred. Her sandwich remained untouched in her lap. Marcus lingered in the doorway. He looked back at her for a moment, his expression caught between loyalty and survival, and something in that hesitation told her everything. Hargrove controlled the schedules. Hargrove assigned the shifts, the overtime, the holidays. Hargrove decided who worked nights and who worked days, who got the good cases and who got the impossible ones. It's not personal, Megan, Marcus said quietly. Hargrove controls the schedule. I can't, he didn't finish the sentence. He just left, his footsteps fading down the corridor. She sat there for 10 more minutes, watching her sandwich. Not eating it. Just understanding how quickly the world could arrange itself around silence. Thursday morning arrived with rain hammering the windows like applause. Megan arrived for the 7 a.m. shift, and during the morning huddle, every nurse gathered around the unit board where assignments and updates were posted. A new paper had appeared overnight in bright red ink, official letterhead from the nursing director, Dr. Hargrove's signature at the bottom. Nurse M. O'Brien, written warning. Failure to follow proper chain of command. Insubordination during physician rounds. Unauthorized questioning of treatment protocols. See director before shift assignment. 12 nurses read it. Megan read it. And from across the room, partially hidden by the pharmacy window, Dr. Hargrove watched her face with a phone pressed to his ear, nodding at whatever voice was speaking on the other end. His expression was the satisfied calm of a man watching a plan unfold exactly as designed. She didn't react. She simply read it, committed it to memory, and walked to her assignment. That afternoon, while she was adjusting an 4-line in room for 29, Hargrove's voice carried across the ICU from the other end, sharp enough to shatter glass. A resident was preparing to place a central line in a new admission. Hargrove stood beside the bed, watching over the procedure, and as Megan moved past with fresh supplies, he spoke loudly enough for the entire unit to hear, "Step back, Nightingale, before you contaminate this field. We don't need any more of your incompetence compromising patient safety." The resident froze mid-preparation. 3 nurses stopped moving. Even the patient, conscious, alert, looked uncertain. Megan set down her supplies on the medication cart with deliberate care. The sound of metal on metal was precise, controlled. She turned, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet enough that Hargrove's colleagues had to lean in to hear it, which meant every word landed with surgical precision. "I've worked in conditions you couldn't imagine, doctor, and I have never once compromised a patient." She didn't wait for his response. She simply walked back to room for 29 and resumed her work as if he hadn't spoken. As if he didn't matter. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened next. At 7 p.m., when the day shift nurses were handing off to nights, when the unit was transitioning into evening rhythms, the resident mentioned to Hargrove that Admiral Chen, the elderly Coast Guard general in the ICU, seemed to be experiencing some subtle changes. "His JVD is a bit elevated," the resident said uncertainly. "And his heart sounds seem a little muffled. Should we get an echo?" Hargrove glanced at the patient roster, saw Admiral Chen's name, and his entire posture shifted. He read through the chart with the careful attention of a man searching for something specific. At the nurse's station, Megan was finishing her charting when she saw his face change, saw the moment he found her notes. 7 documented observations about declining vital signs, increasing central venous pressure, the subtle acoustic changes that suggested fluid accumulation around the heart. All time-stamped. All detailed. All signed by a nurse he'd been systematically dismantling. He pulled her into the med room at 8:06 p.m., exactly 12 hours after his performance in room for 47. The door closed behind them with a soft pneumatic click. They were alone among the 4 stands and medication carts, surrounded by the chemical smell of alcohol prep pads and sterile packaging. "You're reassigned," he said quietly. "Off this patient. Effective immediately." His voice had dropped to the register of a man making a threat that didn't need to be loud to be understood. "His JVD is increasing, his blood pressure is dropping," Megan said, her professional voice cutting through the fluorescent hum. "He needs cardiology consult or imaging. At minimum." "I know who you are, Nightingale." Hargrove's eyes were cold now, emptied of any pretense of professionalism. "I made some calls. Your employment history has some interesting gaps. 3 years of nothing. A complete blank. And when I contacted Joint Base San Antonio asking about your records, they said no comment. No comment. So unless you want me to dig deeper, unless you want me to start asking the Texas Medical Board questions about what exactly happened during those 3 years you're not talking about, you'll stay away from this patient. You'll transfer off this unit. And you'll understand that your time at Oak Creek Memorial is coming to an end. He stepped closer, his presence like a tank idling in a closed garage, all contained power and threat. Clear. Megan nodded once. No words. Just acknowledgement of the new order of things. She was reassigned to the opposite end of the ICU at 9:15 p.m., given a new patient roster, new responsibilities, new charts that kept her on the far side of the unit. But from the hallway between bays 8 and 9, she could still see Admiral Chen's telemetry monitor in the distance. A small green screen displaying his cardiac rhythm, his oxygen saturation, his blood pressure. All of it visible if you knew where to look. At 1:19 a.m., his oxygen saturation dropped from 96 to 89. At 1:52 a.m., it fell to 84. At 2:03 a.m., his blood pressure crashed to 70/40. And Megan, charting in a patient room 3 bays away, heard the monitor's alarm sound like a funeral bell across the darkness of the ICU. The monitor screamed. Cardiac telemetry spiked across the ceiling screen at the nursing station, a pattern Megan recognized before anyone else in the ICU registered it. Not a sudden collapse. Something worse. A slow suffocation. The pressure waveform flattened. The pulsus paradoxus widened. Admiral Chen's blood pressure dropped in increments, 92/60, then 88/58, then 84/56. Fluid filling the pericardial sac around his heart, compressing it like a fist closing. Cardiac tamponade. The automated alarm system didn't trigger because his heart rate was still climbing, 140, 145, 150, his body compensating, fighting, buying time. But there was no time left to buy. Megan stood at the charting station in Trauma Bay 3, 3 patient rooms away, and watched the telemetry numbers descend like a countdown. The ICU was mostly silent at 2:03 a.m. 2 nurses at the desk. 1 resident in the back checking labs. The attending, Dr. Morrison, asleep in the call room, would take 6 minutes to reach the unit if someone paged him. The cardiothoracic surgeon on call was in his car somewhere on I-45, stuck behind a jackknifed semi-truck, at least 40 minutes from the hospital. Megan calculated without moving. She'd done this math before. In Tikrit, outside the walls of a bombed-out clinic, with mortar fire painting the sky orange and a corpsman bleeding out from a femoral wound. 40 minutes. 15 minutes of safe compensation. That was the difference between life and a body bag. She moved toward Admiral Chen's room without thinking, muscle memory and oath superseding the written order Hargrove had left on the charge nurse's desk. Senior Chief O'Brien is not to provide direct patient care to Admiral Chen. Any violation will result in immediate termination. The charge nurse, Deborah Chen, no relation, stepped in front of the doorway. Megan. Stop. His pericardial sac is filling. The cardiothoracic surgeon is en route. Dr. Hargrove said. He's dying. Megan's voice wasn't loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the kind of calm that comes from having already survived impossible things. Blood pressure is 84/52. Heart rate 152. He's compensating. When he decompensates, his heart stops. That happens in approximately 15 minutes. Deborah's hand went toward the phone on the wall. I'm calling Dr. Hargrove. Call him. Megan didn't stop walking. And call the attending. And call the cardiothoracic surgeon. But if you want your patient alive in 20 minutes, you'll let me prep the ultrasound. You're not authorized. I know. Megan reached the supply cart outside Admiral Chen's room, her hands moving with the precise deliberation of someone who'd packed these procedures into rucksacks under fire. Sterile ultrasound probe. Betadine solution. A 14-gauge angiocath needle, one of the few interventions that could be performed without a surgeon present. You can call security after I'm done saving his life. The door to Admiral Chen's room was closed. Through the small window, Megan could see him propped at a 30-degree angle, his chest rising and falling with increasing effort. His abdomen appeared distended, fluid accumulation. His skin had taken on the greyish pallor of a man whose body was running out of oxygen-carrying capacity. The monitor beside his bed showed the same telemetry she'd seen at the nursing station, blood pressure still dropping, heart rate still climbing. The vital sign display looked like a graph of a man running out of time. She opened the door. Behind her, Deborah was dialing. Megan heard her voice. "Dr. Hargrove? It's Deborah Chen at Oak Creek Memorial. She's gone into Admiral Chen's room. I told her no, but she went in anyway." A pause. "Yes, sir. I understand, sir. Right away, sir." The phone went down. Deborah's footsteps retreated toward the nursing station to relay the information. By now, the word was spreading through the ICU like electricity through copper wire. The nurse everyone had been instructed to ignore was violating a direct order. The invisible woman was about to become the most visible person in the hospital. Megan closed the door behind her and locked it. Admiral Chen's eyes were open, tracking her with the clarity of someone whose brain still had oxygen. His lips moved. No sound came out. His breathing sounded like wind through a canyon, fast, shallow, desperate. "I'm Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien," she said, and her voice held something it hadn't held in 3 years. Authority. The register of someone used to people obeying without question. "Your cardiac tamponade requires emergency drainage. I'm going to perform an ultrasound-guided pericardiocentesis. You're going to survive this." He blinked once. Acknowledgement. Trust. The kind of trust that only forms between people who've been trained by the same institutions to understand what must happen and what happens when it doesn't. Megan set the ultrasound on the bedside table and powered it on. The screen flickered to life, a dim blue void. She'd memorized the landmarks of the human thorax in a field hospital near the Tigris River, in a building that had been peppered with shrapnel holes, with a flashlight clamped between her teeth and blood on her boots. The xiphoid process. The midclavicular line. The fourth intercostal space. Anatomical highways that meant the difference between a patient who walked out and a patient who didn't walk out at all. She positioned the ultrasound probe against Admiral Chen's chest, just below his left ribcage. The screen showed fluid, a black void in the grey landscape of cardiac tissue. The pericardial sac, distended with blood like a balloon inflated past capacity. His heart itself was compressed at the center, smaller than it should be, working harder with less room to work in. The monitor behind his head beeped, 160 beats per minute. BP 78/48. Megan prepared the angiocath. 1 needle. 1 chance to decompress the space around his heart. If she missed, she'd puncture the heart itself and cause catastrophic internal bleeding. If she hesitated, Admiral Chen would lose consciousness within 2 minutes, and once he lost consciousness, his compensatory mechanisms would collapse and he'd arrest. If she succeeded, the pressure would release, his heart would re-expand, and in approximately 30 seconds she'd see his blood pressure climb back to livable numbers. She marked the spot where the needle should go with the precision of a combat medic who'd done this before. Her hands didn't shake. Hands that had held lives together don't shake. Hands that have felt the pulse of a dying man under their fingertips don't shake. Hands trained by the United States Navy under conditions Admiral Chen himself had authorized and overseen don't shake. The fluorescent light overhead hummed its constant electric drone. Outside the room, she could hear the ICU waking up. Soft voices. A phone ringing. Footsteps gathering in the hallway. Through the window in the door, she saw Dr. Morrison arriving at the nursing station, still half asleep, listening to Deborah explain what was happening. She saw him reach for the phone to call Hargrove. Admiral Chen's eyes met hers. They held a question and an answer at the same time. "Are you going to save me?" "Yes." "You're going to save me anyway, aren't you?" "Yes." Megan positioned the needle. The tip was ice-cold against her fingers, stainless steel that had been manufactured in a plant in Massachusetts, sterilized in an autoclave, packaged in plastic, and stored in a hospital supply cabinet waiting for exactly this moment. The ultrasound probe in her left hand showed the target. A thin corridor of black fluid between the pericardial membrane and the surface of the heart itself. She advanced the needle into Admiral Chen's chest with the speed of someone who'd made this decision once already, years ago, in a place where hesitation meant funerals. The needle penetrated muscle and bone and sac. The ultrasound image showed the tip entering the fluid space. Dark blood began to flow backward through the angiocath into the collection syringe, deep crimson, the color of oxygen-starved tissue, the color of a heart being strangled by its own bleed. Draw. The syringe filled. 20 milliliters of blood. 30. 40. On the monitor, the pressure wave shifted. The pulses paradoxes widened less. The heart silhouette on the ultrasound screen expanded slightly as the pressure released. 50 milliliters. 60. Admiral Chen's breathing changed. Deeper. Slower. The desperation drained from it. 70 milliliters. The monitor beeped, heart rate 138. Then 130. Then 125. BP 88/54. Climbing. Megan withdrew the needle with the same controlled precision she'd used inserting it. Applied pressure. Inspected the puncture site. His chest rose and fell with the rhythm of a man whose heart could finally expand again, whose oxygen delivery had restored itself, whose body was no longer in free fall toward death. The whole intervention had taken 4 minutes. Behind the closed door, the hallway outside had gone completely quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when 12 medical professionals stop breathing at the same time. Admiral Chen's eyes tracked Megan's face with the deliberate intensity of someone counting down from a cliff and finding solid ground beneath their feet instead of nothing. His lips moved again. This time, a single word emerged, thank. Don't thank me yet, Megan said, and she checked the monitor one more time. Sinus rhythm. Blood pressure stabilizing. Oxygen saturation climbing toward normal. We're not done. She turned toward the window in the door, where Dr. Morrison stood with his mouth slightly open. She unlocked the door, opened it, and made eye contact with every person in the hallway. I need the crash cart positioned outside this room, she said. Not asked. The voice had changed completely now. I need continuous cardiac monitoring with alarms set for any arrhythmias. I need a pericardial drain kit sterile and ready. Admiral Chen will be going to the OR for formal intervention, but the acute emergency has been addressed. Who's calling the cardiothoracic surgeon? Dr. Morrison was still processing what he'd just witnessed. A nurse he'd been instructed to exclude from patient care, had just performed an emergency pericardiocentesis with surgical precision while the attending was sleeping and the on-call specialist was 40 minutes away. I'll call him, Dr. Morrison heard himself say. Tell him it's not an emergency anymore. It's a follow-up. Megan was already moving back into Admiral Chen's room, where she began securing the angiocath in place, documenting vital signs, preparing for the next phase. And someone paged Dr. Hargrove. Tell him his patient survived. The hallway behind her erupted into motion. Phones ringing. Alarm silenced and reset. The ICU shifting from crisis mode into the smooth choreography of emergency management. But Megan was already past all of it, focused entirely on the man in the bed whose chest was finally expanding properly, whose heart could finally beat without suffocation, whose life had depended on her decision to walk through a locked door and violate a direct order from a man whose fraud had already cost dozens of patients thousands of dollars. The ultrasound transducer sat cold against Admiral Chen's chest, the screen showing fluid where there should have been nothing but heart muscle and hope. Megan had 70 seconds before his blood pressure dropped another 5 points, before the pressure around his heart crushed it completely, before his body went into tamponade arrest, the exact same crisis she'd seen 3 times in a sandstorm outside Tikrit when the surgeon was dead and the medevac was 6 hours out and 4 soldiers were bleeding into their own chests. She didn't hesitate. Muscle memory took over. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators circling wounded prey, the 14-gauge angiocath needle gleaming under the harsh ICU lights like a fang. She palpated the landmarks between his ribs, the xiphoid process, the second intercostal space, the anatomical markers she'd memorized in field hospitals under mortar fire, and angled the needle just below the rib margin, advanced it slowly through layers of tissue, feeling resistance yield to pressure, feeling the body's architecture shift under her fingertips like reading braille in the dark. The syringe plunger pulled back. Dark blood filled the chamber. 60 milliliters. 90. 120. The color changed as she withdrew fluid, from deep crimson to lighter red to straw-colored, the fluid pressure finally equalizing, the pericardial sac finally releasing its stranglehold on his heart. Admiral Chen gasped. Not a small intake of breath but a full, desperate gasp, his first complete breath in 20 minutes, his lungs expanding fully for the first time since the bleeding started, his body's oxygen finally reaching his brain, his fingers curling involuntarily against the mattress. His blood pressure climbed on the monitor, 82. 88. 94. His skin color shifted from gray to pink like a photograph developing in chemical solution. His heart rate steadied into sinus rhythm, the monitors beeping normalizing into a rhythm that meant survival, meant success, meant she'd done it. She withdrew the needle, applied pressure with sterile gauze, and documented the procedure with the same meticulous detail she'd maintained for 3 years at Oak Creek Memorial: time of procedure, indication for intervention, technique employed, volume of fluid removed, patient response to treatment. Her hands didn't shake. They never did. When she opened the ICU door, Dr. Hargrove was standing in the corridor with hospital security and the night administrator, all three of them watching her with expressions that shifted from relief to something far colder as they processed what they'd witnessed. He didn't yell. His voice was surgical, precise, every word a scalpel. "Nurse O'Brien, you've just performed a medical procedure outside your scope of practice in direct violation of my explicit orders." Security stepped forward. His collar insignia caught the fluorescent lights as he moved. "Termination is effective immediately. Hand over your badge." Megan removed the plastic ID from around her neck. 3 years of shifts, 3 years of invisible service, 3 years of asking permission in a hospital where permission was always withheld, and handed it to the security officer without a word. 12 nurses stood scattered through the ICU corridor. Not one met her eyes. She walked past them toward the locker room, past the supply stations and the medication carts and the place where she'd spent 1,000 nights keeping people alive, and changed out of her scrubs in the empty break room at 4 a.m., the clock on the wall ticking like a countdown to something she couldn't stop. By dawn, Dr. Hargrove had made 3 calls. The first was to the hospital board chairman, a man with a $4,000 suit and a chronic dependency on Hargrove's referral network. He owed favors worth nearly $500,000 in annual contracts. "Liability issue," Hargrove had said, his voice smooth as oil. "Dangerous nurse operating outside scope. No choice but to terminate immediately." The board chairman had agreed without asking questions. Debts in medical administration were paid in silence. The second call went to a Texas nursing board investigator he'd met at a conference in San Antonio 3 years ago, a woman who'd always been receptive to his professional opinions. "Rogue surgical nurse," he said. "Operating independently, contaminating scenes, ignoring protocol. You should probably open an investigation before she harms someone else." The investigator had opened a file within the hour. The third call went to Joint Base San Antonio, a routine inquiry about employment history, a simple personnel records request for a nurse named Megan O'Brien. What came back was a 3-year gap in documentation and a terse response stamped in red, "No comment." Hargrove had stared at that response for 7 minutes, something cold creeping up the back of his spine. Gaps like that didn't exist in civilian records. They only existed when the Department of Defense was protecting something. Or someone. At 9 a.m., Megan sat across from the hospital's HR director in a small gray office that smelled like recycled air and desperation. The termination letter sat between them like a corpse. "You violated protocol," the HR director said, not meeting her eyes. "You performed a medical procedure outside your scope, against direct physician orders." Megan tried to speak. He was in cardiac tamponade. His heart would have stopped in minutes. The HR director cut her off with the efficiency of a man who'd rehearsed this exact line. "You're lucky we're not filing criminal charges." His voice carried the tone of someone reading from a corporate checklist, each word disconnected from meaning or consequence. She tried again. "I saved his life. I performed an emergency procedure that required," he held up his hand. "Your employment with Oak Creek Memorial is terminated effective immediately. You'll receive 2 weeks severance. Security will escort you out." There was nothing in his voice that suggested he understood what she was telling him, nothing that suggested he'd even heard the words. She gathered her belongings and walked out through the parking lot at 10 a.m. on a Monday morning while the hospital bustled with staff changes and code pages and the daily machinery of saving lives, and she was no longer part of that machinery. She was just a woman in jeans and a borrowed jacket, walking to a car that suddenly felt very small. That afternoon, David O'Brien arrived at their small Houston house in his Coast Guard dress uniform, the blue wool pressed into sharp lines, the insignia on his collar bright with Polish. He was 24 years old, commissioned as an officer, standing in his mother's kitchen doorway with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly where you belong. He expected to surprise her? Instead, he found her at the kitchen table in the scrubs she'd worn for the last 3 years, Oak Creek Memorial embroidered across the chest in fading blue thread, the termination letter crumpled in her fist, her shoulders curved inward, her eyes red and swollen in a way he'd only seen once before, when he was 8 years old and she'd gotten the phone call about his father. She was crying. Not silently or with restraint or with the kind of composed grief that adults were supposed to manage. She was crying the way someone cries when everything they've built is suddenly gone, when the world has decided they don't exist. David stood frozen in the doorway, 19 years of muscle memory telling him that his mother didn't break down, that Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien was made of something harder than tears, that the woman at the kitchen table was someone he'd only seen in photographs and stories from a life before his birth. "Mom." His voice cracked. "Why are you home?" She couldn't speak. She just shook her head, the motion so small it was almost invisible. He sat beside her at the table, this young officer in his pressed dress uniform, utterly helpless for the first time in years, and asked the only question he could form, "What happened?" She stared at the crumpled letter in her hands without answering, and for the first time since he was 8 years old, he watched his mother cry without understanding why, without being able to fix it, without the faintest idea that the woman sitting next to him was about to change the entire trajectory of his life and the reputation of everyone who'd ever doubted her. 3 days later, Admiral Chen's eyes opened with the clarity of a man returning from the edge. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm beside him, but his chest rose and fell with his own breathing now, steady and strong. The morning light cut through the ICU windows in sharp geometric angles, and in that light, his gaze locked onto the figure moving through the unit with quiet purpose. Megan was collecting her belongings from the locker room, 3 years of careful erasure being packed into a single cardboard box. A spare scrub top. 2 pairs of compression socks. The laminated employee ID that had meant nothing to anyone. Her hands moved with methodical precision, the way hands move when the mind is somewhere else entirely, somewhere darker. She didn't hear the Admiral's call button. Didn't know he'd waited until the nurse's station was clear, until only the electronic beep of monitors filled the silence. But when she passed his room, one last walk through a hallway she'd never walk again, his whisper stopped her cold. Reaper. 1 word. Not a name. A call sign. The air in her chest froze. She turned slowly, and Admiral Chen's eyes, still weak with medication but sharp as broken glass, held hers with absolute recognition. His right hand lifted from the bed rail with tremendous effort, trembling not from weakness but from the weight of memory. "That's impossible," she said. "Not a question. Come here." It wasn't a request. It was a command. She did. Military training ran deeper than 3 years of nursing school. She stood at attention beside his bed, and Admiral Chen studied her face as if reading classified documentation. "I knew Reaper," he said quietly. "Tikrit. Jolin District. You held my men together for 11 days in a field hospital with a roof made of tarps and prayers." He paused, breathing carefully. You stabilized Lieutenant Commander Morrison when he took a round through the abdomen. You're the reason he made it home." Megan's jaw clenched. The box in her hand suddenly weighed 8,000 pounds. "David never told me," the Admiral continued. "Never mentioned his mother served. Never said she was." He trailed off, understanding flooding his weathered features. "You were declared KIA for operational security," she said flatly. "I exist." "I don't exist." "It depends on the paperwork." Admiral Chen reached for his bedside phone with shaking fingers. "That changes now." Before she could stop him, he'd ordered the hospital administrator and every member of the board to his room immediately. Within 17 minutes, they arrived, confused, resentful, already annoyed at being summoned by a patient. Megan stood against the far wall, her box still in her hands, invisible as she'd always been. The Admiral's voice was weak but carried the force of a man who'd commanded thousands. "I want her file. Everything she submitted when she was hired. Pull it from storage." "Sir, visiting hours," the administrator began. "Now." The records appeared 40 minutes later, retrieved from deep filing with dust still settling on the folder. Classified stamps. Redacted sections. 3-year employment gap with a single notation, no comment. Admiral Chen opened the file himself, reading slowly, his expression growing harder with each page. "When did you save my life in the ICU?" he asked Megan. "Tuesday, 2 a.m. Cardiac tamponade. You were in the early stages of..." She stopped. Something was wrong. His eyes held a knowledge that went too deep. "You performed a pericardiocentesis," he said. It wasn't a question. Under the care restrictions Dr. Hargrove imposed. Off protocol. Probably against direct orders. "How did you?" "Because I was conscious for part of it." "You said breathe, Admiral. Just breathe." "And then I could. And then I heard Dr. Hargrove screaming that you were terminated for practicing outside scope." He closed his eyes. "They fired the woman who saved my life for saving my life." The door to his room burst open. David stood in the frame, dress uniform perfectly pressed, the insignia of his rank catching the fluorescent light. His eyes found his mother standing against the wall, and his entire body went rigid. "Senior Chief." His voice cracked on the word. Not the mom. The title that changed everything. Megan's hands began to tremble around the cardboard box. After 3 years of perfect control, of remaining invisible, of compartmentalizing the woman who'd held a field hospital together from the woman who'd made his school lunches, her hands betrayed her. David took a step forward, processing, his uniform suddenly fitting him differently, a young officer discovering his mother wasn't a nurse at all. She was Reaper. "Your mother," Admiral Chen said quietly, "is Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien. Decorated medic. Combat veteran. The reason I'm breathing." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then every alarm in the ICU seemed to sound at once. A Navy SEAL captain arrived at Oak Creek Memorial within the hour. His presence altered the air pressure in the building like a storm front rolling in, tall enough to duck through the standard doorways, wide enough that his uniform had to be a custom cut. He wore the insignia of Naval Special Warfare Development Group, the color of his eyes the gray of cold ocean during combat operations. The hospital board chairman's face paled when Captain Graves was escorted to the ICU conference room. Behind him walked an FBI liaison, a woman with a tablet and the bearing of someone used to delivering bad news to powerful people. Captain Graves stood before the hastily assembled hospital leadership with the casual authority of a man who'd been in worse rooms during far worse circumstances. His voice was level, informative, devastating. Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien served 11 years in Naval Special Warfare, attached to 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, a Dark Horse Company, with combat deployments to Anbar Province, Helmand, and Nimruz, he began. During the siege of Tikrit, Jolan District, she was the senior medic for Phi Base Vulcan. 1 building. 13 Marines. 11 days of continuous combat. He paused, letting that settle like shrapnel. Her unit sustained 73% casualties. She kept 12 men alive who should have died. 2 of them are now commanding officers. 1 is a SEAL Team 6 operator. 1 is the man lying in the hospital bed upstairs. The board chairman shifted uncomfortably. Dr. Hargrove, standing near the window, had gone the color of old bone. She earned a Silver Star for that deployment, Captain Graves continued. She earned a second Silver Star for training operations in Helmand Province where she coordinated aerial medevac under fire and saved 8 personnel. He pulled a photograph from his jacket. This is her in Tikrit. This is her after the Phi base was hit with a mortar round. This is her refusing extraction to stay with her Marines. Another photograph. Then another. She also earned 2 Bronze Stars for Valor. 1 in Helmand. 1 in training operations where she performed field surgery on a colleague with a sucking chest wound using tactical packing and a combat application tourniquet, then manned a defensive position for 43 minutes until support arrived. He lowered the photographs. The colleague she saved was Rear Admiral Chen's nephew. The Admiral didn't know that until this morning. The FBI liaison stepped forward. She opened her tablet with practiced precision. The other reason Senior Chief O'Brien was assigned to this hospital under a protected placement, she said, is that she testified against 3 contractors, Pelham Defense Solutions, Mitchell Crane Logistics, and Turner Supply, for systematic diversion of medical equipment destined for field hospitals. Her fingers moved across the screen. Antibiotics listed as delivered but warehoused in Baghdad. Surgical kits sold to private military contractors. Wound dressing supplies rerouted to black market medical clinics. Estimated value, $460,000. When Senior Chief O'Brien's documentation flagged the discrepancies, she became a witness. Dr. Hargrove's hands clenched into fists. That testimony was buried when the case was classified, the FBI liaison continued. Senior Chief O'Brien was placed under witness-style erasure, living under restricted identification, employment record sealed, limited contact with her previous unit. For her safety. For the investigation's integrity. She turned the tablet toward the board. For 3 years, she was no one. Just a nurse at Oak Creek Memorial. Invisible. Forgettable. Until she saved an admiral's life. The board chairman's face cycled through shock, horror, and something close to fury. Admiral Chen was brought to the boardroom in a wheelchair, still weak but moving with the stubborn authority of a man who'd learned long ago that pain is information, not permission to surrender. He wore his service dress uniform, the medals aligned precisely on his chest like a statement in gold and ribbon. Behind him, David stood in dress whites, his young face carrying the weight of newly understood truths. Admiral, the board chairman began carefully, we're already opening an investigation into. I don't care what you're investigating, Admiral Chen said flatly. I care about Dr. Hargrove's privileges here. I want them terminated. Now. Today. In front of whatever cameras are outside this building. He looked directly at Hargrove. You tried to destroy the woman who saved my life because she was better than you. You made her invisible because it was easier than facing her competence. And you did it in front of her son, who watches you like you walk on water. He paused, his breathing deliberate and careful. That ends today. The hospital's legal counsel had already made calls. CNN had already dispatched a crew. The Texas Nursing Board investigator who'd filed false complaints against Megan, under pressure from Hargrove, was already recanting, already opening an investigation into who'd filed the false reports in the first place. But the moment that mattered, the moment that would live on every medical school bulletin board and every hospital ethics presentation for years to come, was when Rear Admiral Chen, still weak but impossibly present, looked directly at the cameras and said, sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Senior Chief O'Brien carried both. Dr. Hargrove's carefully constructed network collapsed like a house in a hurricane. The board chairman who owed him for referrals physically stepped backward, distancing himself with the precision of a man protecting his own career. The FBI agent opened another folder: pharmaceutical billing records, imaging charges for procedures that never happened, equipment costs inflated by margins that made predatory lending look conservative. "Your medical license is suspended effective immediately," the board chairman said to Hargrove. His voice carried no emotion. "We'll be cooperating with the FBI, the Texas Medical Board, and the Department of Justice. You need a lawyer. A good one." By evening, the footage was viral. Decorated military officer condemning corrupt doctor who fired a war hero. Military hero recognized after 3 years of erasure. The story ran on every newscast, shared across every platform, headlined in every medical ethics discussion. By midnight, Hargrove's surgical privileges were revoked. By morning, his partnership at the group dissolved. Megan watched it all unfold from her living room, David beside her, still processing that the woman who'd made his school lunches was Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien, that she'd been declared KIA for operational security, that she'd lived in erasure for 3 years to keep him safe. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked carefully. She touched the faded unit patch beneath her jacket collar. "I was ordered not to exist." "That meant you couldn't know. If you knew, you'd react differently, treat me differently, maybe slip up. The safest thing I could give you was normal." He took her hand. "You gave me everything. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, if you've ever wondered what it would feel like to finally have that moment of recognition, like and subscribe." The next video reveals what happens when a military hero gets offered a second chance at the career she sacrificed everything for. Comment below, would you have done the same thing in her position?